In our last video, we looked at economic growth and how we can illustrate that in the PPC model. But there's another model in which we can illustrate economic growth. That is aggregate demand and aggregate supply, a model that you already know. Well, the way we can illustrate economic growth, which is a long-run phenomenon, is by taking a careful look at the long-run aggregate supply curve. You should recall from your study of aggregate demand and aggregate supply that the model has an x-axis label, real GDP, and the y-axis, price level. Now, our focus is on economic growth, so we're looking at the long run. So we're particularly concerned with that vertical line, the long-run aggregate supply curve. The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. That means it doesn't change. Our output doesn't change with the price level. In fact, really, there's only two things that will change our potential output. That is, more resources or better technology. So you learned in this model that full employment is the level of output where we draw the long-run aggregate supply curve. If our potential output increases, if we get more capital, or if we get better technology, our potential to produce goods and services increases. That is, our full employment output increases, and long-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. We'll have a new potential output. So that shift to the right represents economic growth, an increase in our potential, our productive capacity. Now, that's pretty straightforward to see that economic growth, when it occurs, it doesn't show all of the steps like the PPC model did, but when economic growth occurs, LRAS shifts to the right. When we were at the original long-run aggregate supply curve, that full employment level of output was associated with the natural rate of unemployment. Now, with more capital, physical or human capital, or improved technology, we've increased our potential to produce goods and services, so the LRAS curve will shift to the right. There's a new full employment level of output as the LRAS shifts to the right. Now that graph looks like it's a pretty easy one to draw. Vertical line shifting to the right. But it does get a little bit messy when we put aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply in there, and they're moving all around representing all of the economic fluctuations in the economy. But what's nice about this is as those things are occurring, we can still see what's happening to the economy's capacity. Now, let's go ahead and get a little bit messy by adding in aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, with a focus on what's happening to economic growth. This will allow us to review some of the things we learned about aggregate demand and aggregate supply as well. So let's set this back up with real GDP on our x-axis, price level on our y-axis, the long-run aggregate supply, vertical at the full employment level of output, a upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, and then a downward sloping aggregate demand. Now, you see that the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply occurs at a point that is less than the full employment level of output. Remember, the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply determines the price level and the level of production, the current level of production in an economy. So we have a recessionary gap here. We're going to see aggregate demand shift to the right. That's going to lead us to get a higher level of production in the economy, as well as a higher price level. But that increase in production was not economic growth. We got an increase in production, but our productive capacity didn't change. Our potential output didn't change. We just got out of the recession back up to our potential. Now, we see then, when we look at the graph, that there are some economic fluctuations that occur, but when you look back at what's underneath the long-run aggregate supply curve, that tells you what's going on with the capacity. Now, this one was consumption, this example that we've drawn here. But let's switch that up. What if it was investment? It's common for students to get confused because they say, oh yeah, investment spending leads to growth. But there is an important timing issue. So when we have an increase in investment spending, that's going to affect aggregate demand today. We're going to get a shift in aggregate demand, which will affect production, the current level of production, but not the productive capacity. But if we wait for it, next year, when those machines, tools, and factories that we invested in become a part of the capital stock and become available for productive use, then the long-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right. We will get the growth, not this year, because investment spending this year shifts the aggregate demand curve, only affecting production, not full employment output. But next year, as those investment goods, the new investment, becomes part of the capital stock, that increase in capital stock increases the economy's potential to produce goods and services, and the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Now we've got two different models to show economic growth. One of the advantages of looking at long-run aggregate supply, as simple as that is, a vertical line shifting to the right, is that we can see what's going on in the long run, what's happening with economic growth while the economy is going through economic fluctuations with short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand shifting all around the LRAS. The PPC, though, shows the steps in this process of economic growth. So there's advantages to each, but let's not forget the connections between both. In both cases, if we get more resources, more capital stock, or better technology, in both cases we're going to get shifts in those models. LRAS shifting to the right and PPC shifting away from the origin. Two different ways to illustrate the same story. Now, you may not need much practice drawing a vertical line and shifting it to the right, but you can certainly use some practice on making sure you understand it. So take a look at the activities that follow.